and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, the Russian ambassador to Turkey was shot dead in Ankara. Russia was quick to label it as a terrorist attack, while Turkey grapples with its own security. And rural planners, fresh out of a work conference in China, carry out policy changes in farmland rights and supply-side reform to secure the country's rural development. Today, the world is shadowed by three violent incidents which happened overnight. Russia's ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, was shot and killed while delivering a speech at an art gallery in the Turkish capital, Ankara. In Germany, a truck plowed into a crowded Christmas market in Berlin, killing at least 12 people and injuring nearly 50. And in Switzerland, a man stormed a Zurich mosque and opened fire, injuring 3 people. So what is going on over there, and what is wrong with our world?
The attack took place in Ankara at the Contemporary Art Gallery as the Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov was delivering a speech. He was shot from behind by a lone gunman. The Turkish Interior Minister disclosed details about the gunman.
Saldırgan 24 Haziran.
The attacker was born in 1994 in Aydın, Turkey. He registered at Manisa, graduated from Suke Anatolian High School, and Rüştü Unsal Police Academy, and Mevlut Mut Altintaş had been working at Ankara Riot Police for 2.5 years.
It's still not clear if he had links to any group. The gunman had managed to enter the gallery with his police identification, though he was off duty at the time of the attack. Shortly after, Turkish special forces killed the attacker. The attack came a day before the foreign ministers of Russia, Turkey and Iran met in Moscow to discuss the latest evacuation efforts in Aleppo, Syria.
The committed crime is obviously a provocation designed to spoil normalization of Russia-Turkey relations and derailing peace process in Syria, which is actively promoted by Russia, Turkey, Iran and other countries interested in reconciliation of inter-Syria conflict.
Russian President Putin added the only response to the murder is to step up the fight against terror. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke on the phone with President Putin, and they pledged to cooperate.
The Russian authorities said it's better to join the ongoing investigation with their officials, and we said there isn't any problem from our side to help out with this investigation.
The attack has been condemned by the international community and raised issues over global security. Would the diplomat's killing stain Russia-Turkey relations or spur the two countries to fight terrorism closer together?
So how will a diplomat assassination shape relations between Russia and Turkey? To answer that question, I'm joined here by Mr. Cui Hongjian from China Institute of International Studies. Meanwhile, in Ankara, Turkey, we are joined by Professor Selçuk Çalhanoğlu, who is an advisor to for the Center for Strategic Research of the Turkish Foreign Ministry. I want to welcome both of you gentlemen later. We are hoping to also get across to a Russian panelist with us. First of all, Mr. Çalhanoğlu, may I ask for your response of the 3 series of attacks, apparently all terrorist attacks, going on in Turkey, in Germany, and also in Switzerland, just over the past 24 hours. Briefly, sir.
Actually, we experienced very difficult time for yesterday night here in Turkey and Europe. So these are very tragic events. So now we can see that the world, our world is not very large, and also every incident, every negative things has a spillover effect to the other countries. So we can see the results yesterday. So we simply saying that the destabilization of Middle East in general, from Afghanistan to Syria and Iraq and then Libya, so there is a spillover effect to other countries. So we can experience these outcomes right now. So this also clearly indicate that the countries around the world come together and also find a logical ground to discuss and elaborate the issue in general.
Mr. Cui, what about you observing from China?
Yeah, because actually I think firstly it shows how this turbulent world facing, more and more risks, more and more dangers. And also I think it will be a wake-up call for maybe every country, for everybody in the world. How is this, fragile, the peace in the world? So I think certainly it will also give some more dynamic to more of the countries and most of the international community.
Well,
to work
whether
together.
that is true or not,
Yes.
we'll have to look at the details. So
Yes.
why don't we, for today at least, focus on the issue
Yeah.
between Turkey and Russia. Professor Çalhanoğlu, what do you make so far of the identity of this young man who apparently has been the killer who killed the Russian diplomat? What do you think has been his background? What do you consider as the reasons why he is reacting or acting in such an extreme way?
First of all, yesterday night Turkey experienced a very tragic event. Ambassador Andrei Karlov was a well-respected diplomat and also well-known diplomat in Ankara. Personally, I had chance to meet several times. So it was a great loss for Turkish diplomatic community in Ankara, and also it was a great loss for the building relationship between Turkey and Russia in general, and also ongoing peace process, peace deal in Syria, because Ambassador Karlov was very active player on the ground, contacting with the Bashar regime and also opposition elements in Syria. So this was, of course, very tragic and negative event for that. So when we look at the murderer of the Ambassador Karlov, he was a police officer, off-duty police officer, and also killed. After killing him, also shouted this killing because of the Syrian issue and also because of for the sake of the victims of the Aleppo. So there is a refer to Syrian clashes, particularly the clashes in Aleppo. So then this showing that how the situation is difficult to settle down the issues in Syria and also management of the bilateral relations between Turkey and Russia. So it's all these things are interrelated to each other.
Mr. Çalhanoğlu, you talk about the outside negotiation between Turkey and Russia, but I think in a way that incident seemed to also reflect the internal division in the Turkish society about what role Turkey should play in terms of the crisis going on in Syria and which side Turkey should be on. Briefly from you. Professor Çalhanoğlu?
Yeah, okay. So this is also a clear sign that, of course, there is a discussion, debate in Turkey about the spillover effect of Syrian crisis to Turkey. But we can say that this is a general trend because of the output of the migration in general and also some negative effect for security and safety of cities. So recently we talked about the PKK affiliated group terror attacks. Also they stemmed from Syrian crisis. But luckily here the both sides, particularly the Turkey and Russia, have a consensus that the provocative attack to Russian ambassador will not affect the ongoing relations between Turkey and Russia and also ongoing negotiations for the settlement of the Syrian issue.
We heard that point very clearly, but we still want to hear more, if you can, Professor, about what does that represent about the division within the Turkish society itself in terms of what to do about Syria. We're going to come back to you if you could answer us briefly about that. Let's for now on the phone with us Dmitry Barbish, a political analyst from the Sputnik International News Agency based in Moscow. Mr. Barbish, welcome to be with us on this program. So may I have your brief response about the latest incidents? What is Moscow making out of this about what's going on inside Turkey and possible Turkish-Russia relations? Briefly.
Well, obviously, this assassination of our ambassador, it was directed to harming the relations between Russia and Turkey, spoiling them on the eve of a very important meeting, you know. However, that meeting is taking place in Moscow right now. It's a meeting of the Turkish, Russian, and Iranian foreign ministers. I am covering this meeting, so I'm joining you now by phone. And the news that I am covering, these are sensational news, because the Turkish defense minister, Fikri Ishik, called the evacuation of Aleppo a liberation. Let me stress it one more time, liberation of Aleppo. And he said that this liberation was made successfully by Russia. So this is a real revolution for the Turkish foreign policy, because, as you might know, Turkey, from the very beginning of the civil war in Syria, supported the armed opposition to Mr. Assad. But obviously now there was some kind of a deal reached between Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine. So the Turks will not insist on Aleppo being controlled by the rebels. In exchange, probably they will get some influence in the north of the country. But the main thing is that Russia, Turkey, and Iran agreed to fight against the extremists, against the terrorists in the north of Syria.
Right.
That means that the war in Syria may soon come to an end, at least in the sector controlled by the Turkish, Iranian, and the Russian.
Mr. Barbish, may I say you are a little bit too optimistic from my perspective, but I want to ask a little bit more in detail about your judgment. Sir, to what extent do you think all sides, particularly now, since we're focusing on Turkish-Russia relations, the two countries are willing to compromise towards one another about their roles inside Syria and also about the territories which they support the local forces, one is government, one is more rebel forces, to have? Is that going to be a very fragile line that we are at this moment?
Well, of course, in the situation when we still have a civil war in Syria, every agreement is fragile. And I agree with you that one should not be over-optimistic. But quite clearly, it looks like Mr. Erdogan realized that he made a mistake when he got involved in the Syrian civil war, throwing his lot with just one of the sides.
All right.
And the difference between Mr. Erdogan and the EU, for example, the European Union or the United States, is that Mr. Erdogan can make the mistakes, but then he corrects them. He can correct his political course. We have seen it.
Okay.
The problem with the EU is that they cannot correct their mistake. If they decided to do something absurd, such as, for example, to live without Russian natural gas, they will push for it until they wall.
Mr. Barbish, we want to still focus on Turkish-Russia relations for now. You want to stay with us on the phone, please, sir. And let me come back to you, Mr. Cui, here in the Beijing studio. Supposed to be, and it is, a very tragic incident. A diplomat is killed. However, this seemed to be a turning point of the ongoing tough negotiations between Turkey and Russia about Syria.
Yes, certainly. I think now, because it's almost a live issue. I mean, for this tragedy, and also the attack of the target of the terrorism attack is a diplomat. So I think it shows so far, including United States, European Union, they showed a very, big condemns on this event. I think it shows now, maybe at this moment, maybe temporarily, there will be a joint alliance or joint, feelings from every players to say that, okay, it shows that terrorism would be the common enemy. So I think maybe it will be out of the purpose of a sign to maybe damage or destroy this relations between Turkey and Russia, and to show some maybe immorality of action of Russia in Aleppo, in Syria. But I think now the effect will be in another direction.
I see.
Yeah.
Mr. Cui, as you may know, on the ground, the situation is very complicated.
Yes.
There's so many different forces backed by so many different powers in the region and beyond. And they are having sometimes cross-interest, sometimes totally against one another, very fluid. We want to show our audience a little bit about that. Within the battered city of Aleppo, for example, there are several forces. On the government side, state forces are augmented by the Russian airstrike, as some say, and Shia militias, including fighters from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Pakistan, some suggest. The predominantly Sunni opposition is made up of several rebel groups, many of whom have received financial aid from key opponents of the President Bashar Assad, including the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, at least according to media reports. Hardline Islamist groups are involved as well, most notably the Nusra Front. It announced it was cutting ties with al-Qaeda, but we do not know at this moment what exactly happened. That is why we are saying, Mr. Cui, there's so many things on the ground that is fluid, and therefore will these all moving factors eventually fall into the right places and therefore help an agreement to be created? That is the big question. Is this going to really help in the long term? I mean, what is happening now between Turkey and Russia? We see the two foreign ministers, they met, they talked to each other cordially, and also they talk about common goals. They apparently made compromises about where they were before, but how long will that last? What is the key interest here?
Yes, exactly. It's a very, important question for this current situation. Also, we know, especially on the issue of Syria, especially the political negotiation, everything. Indeed, because they are from a different stance. I mean, Turkey and Russia, they do have a bigger divergence because, as we know, Turkey is a part of the U.S.-led alliance anti-terrorism in Syria, and also Turkey. The purpose of Turkey is to, take over this Assad regime, and it's different from Russia's stance. But now I think maybe if we call it a turning point of this, incident, that we be sure that, especially after the short-lived coup, as we know, it looks like the Erdogan government and the Russian government, they try to change the priority of the bilateral relations. Now it looks like the political trust become more important than the divergence between them in Syria. And also at this moment, once this incident happened, from Turkish side, it will try to show some more sensories to Russia, say that, okay, I will give some compensation to Russia.
How long will that sincerity, as being mentioned by Mr. Cui, Mr. Çalhanoğlu, likely to last toward Russia? Do you agree with what the Chinese guest just said?
Actually, when we look at President Putin's message after the assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey, he underlined two things. One, the ongoing Turkish-Russian dialogue will continue, and the second one, Russia would fight against the terrorists, all terrorist groups, and particularly the terrorist groups behind this attack, very decisively. So, of course, there are the different scenarios for that, because in the case of bilateral relationship, so there is a deep cooperation between two sides to enlighten the assassination against the Russian ambassador. But on the other, we don't know yet how Turkish and Russian cooperation will continue on the ground of Syria. Today, there is a very important meeting in Moscow, trilateral ministerial meetings, consisted by foreign and defense ministers.
What do you think can be the result?
So this meeting,
what do you think can be the result, Professor? That's what we would really want to know. We know there's a meeting going on, but what we want to know is what can be the result of this meeting?
Actually, this meeting is a pre-planned meeting before the incident, but the Russian side confirmed that the meeting would be carried out, particularly on Syria. On the first side, the evacuation of the civilians in eastern Aleppo, rebel-held eastern Aleppo, and in the long run, the long-term settlement of Syrian issue in general.
Okay.
But also, Russia has a facilitator role between Turkey and Iran. Of course, Turkey and Iran are neighbor countries having very good economic relations, very intensive economic relations. But on the other, Turkish-Iranian strategic and military cooperation is very, very weak.
Yes,
and
indeed.
Russia has a positive role to promote
Mr. Barbish.
direct dialogue between Turkey and Iran.
Mr. Barbish, do you think, Mr. Barbish, do you think that Russia will be able to fulfill all these roles as being mentioned by our Turkish counterpart? Meanwhile, how long do you think the two sides will be able to work on it, given there is also another factor, both the EU and the United States, they all have an opinion about what is going on in Syria?
I can only tell you several facts which I think are important, and they will kind of explain my position, my rather optimistic position. Immediately after the assassination of the Russian ambassador, the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan called it an attack against Turkish nation, an attack against Turkish state, and an attack against Turkey. So that was very well received in Russia.
Okay.
And obviously the people who planned that this assassination would derail Russian-Turkish relations, these people miscalculated. And as for relations between Turkey, Russia, and the United States, that kind of triangle, if you look at the recent statements by the Turkish officials, Mr. Erdogan in the first place, you will see that Erdogan was much more critical of the United States than of Russia. So these are important facts which I think should be taken into account.
All right.
And they show that Turkey is becoming more and more an independent country, kind of distancing itself from NATO because Turkey wants to conduct its own independent policy.
I see. Mr. Barbish, thank you for your analysis. And let me come back finally to you, Mr. Cui, before we go. Obviously, all sides are planning about the agenda forward.
Yeah.
This is a very tragic incident, but this could be a turning point. We haven't counted in the uncertainty of the president-elect, Mr. Trump, who has not been talking much at all about terrorism.
Yeah.
So what do you think all of these eventually could mean for the upcoming U.S. president into the White House and the U.S. relationship with Russia and also with the Turkey, of course?
Yeah, I think if what
briefly, if you can answer.
if what mentioned by Mr. Trump during the campaign is true, and Mr. Trump will try to introduce the commitment of him into the policy once he takes the power, and I think now it's a good chance for Mr. Trump, firstly, to have a relaxation of the relations with Russia, and then to do something more, especially in cooperating with Russia in anti-terrorism.
It was a terrorist attack. It was a tragic incident, but it really depends on how people are taking advantage of this sad incident to make sure it could go in a better way. We want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our program. Rural planners agree in China in a work conference to tweak farmland rights and pursue supply-side reforms. What do they mean? We're going to explain after we come back. You are still watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday on CCTV News. And now we turn to China's Central Conference on Rural Work. The annual gathering sets the tone for the following year's agriculture and rural development. This time, the separation of farmland rights and the supply-side structural reforms in agriculture get more attention as they are becoming more critical to the nation's food security. So how will the reforms affect farmers' lives and the overall development of China's economy? Take a look.
As the year comes to an end, some big changes are going to happen in rural areas. Now local farmers are officially allowed to split farmland ownership rights, contract rights, and operating rights. That means more people who want to farm can do so, while letting holders of land rights who'd rather leave farming move on to greener pastures.
As the natural progression of industrialization becomes more advanced, have transferred to urban areas, natural competition is then formed.
The practice of separating rights ownership and farmland management was first adopted covertly, initially without the blessing of local authorities in 1979 in Shaogang village. The farmers then were to hold all responsibility for profits and losses from the land. The land arrangement was later adopted as a standard practice across China. Since then, many wanted to leave and go work in the city, but people had to stay and farm the land. Separating ownership from management allowed many to do so. Farmers can now finally retain full rights to their allotted land, even if they choose to lease the land to others. These reforms have come a long way.
After you get your certificate, or you could call it a permit, you can easily transfer the operating rights to a third party if you wish to work in the city. And if you wish to farm your own land, now you have a sense of security with this certificate.
On the other hand, to open up the nation's vast farming sector, the government also plans to promote public-private partnership in the agricultural industry. Along with the sustainable and healthy development of agriculture, authorities plan to carry out supply-side structural reforms to spur growth.
Developing supply-side structural reforms in agriculture includes the following measures: adjusting the structure, increasing the quality of agri products, boosting the convergence of agriculture and tourism, lowering costs, and improving the infrastructure. But I think the most important adjustments need to happen to the structure of the industry.
With these reforms in place, farmers can manage their land and production with more security and efficiency. And the reforms will not only be a big step forward in protecting the interests of farmer operators, but also help meet the growing demand of modernization.
And for more on China's Rural World Conference and what exactly the result mean for China's agricultural development, we're joined here at Beijing studio. Ms. Shi Yan, who is the Executive Director of Shared Harvest CSA Farm in Beijing, Dr. Holly Wang, Agricultural Economics Professor at Purdue University in the U.S., now joining us in Beijing studio as well. She's also Global Expert Program of China's Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C., Mr. John MacArthur, who is a Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. I want to welcome the three of you to talk about this very important topic for China. So, structural reform, and structural reform. They say the most important thing should be emphasized 3 times. We just did that. But this time, it is the very first time it is being used in China's agricultural development. Exactly what it means, Holly.
Structural reform, Chinese agriculture overall, the supply is not oversupplied, unlike the manufacturing industry. However, the distribution of resources like land and water and capitals is not exactly balanced or meeting the demand of consumers. So that there are a lot of things to do to distribute the different resources.
I see. Do you agree with what Holly said, Yan?
I think nowadays our agriculture are meeting lots of challenges like resources, pollution, and also people, especially the middle class people in the city, they want healthy food. So I think that driving the demands and also the structural change. If we can produce more food, while at the same time we have to guarantee the food safety and the agriculture sustainability.
Right. So the structural reform we are talking about here when we talk China's rural development out of this conference is actually not necessarily about overcapacity. It is more about how to allocate the right resources for the right direction of development. But how?
I think now...
I'm sorry I throw you a big question, but that has to be asked. Yan.
I think the most important thing is how, if we could have the farmers, the peasants, can they organized as a real comprehensive cooperative? Because nowadays the cooperatives are mostly specialized cooperatives. So the farmers can only have like green cooperatives or grape cooperative, apple cooperatives, but can we allow them to do like financial cooperatives?
Financial cooperatives meaning what?
So that meaning that they can be cooperative in all different fields. And also, can we allow the different interest groups, can the farmers also share the interest? That's most important.
That is a very fundamental question. After all, the farmers' population still occupy a huge percentage of China's overall. So their livelihood really means a lot about the overall development of China. So Holly, what do you take of that?
I think that as an economist, I still believe that market can play a bigger role in the reform, restructure. So actually, our policies are still very powerful. So government should think about a step down and or step backward a little bit and let the market to play its role. So let the market as an indication to allocate the resources. I think she just mentioned farm cooperatives. That's one measure, definitely. But there are many other ways.
Well, we're going to talk about the role of the market. It's going to be a big argument in terms of China's rural development. But for now, let me go to you, Mr. MacArthur. Of course, you have been studying agricultural development in many countries and rural development. China is at this very unique stage, shall we say, of its rural development. Overall speaking, which stage is it from your perspective? And also the challenges facing China's agricultural development, solution this time being subscribed. Historically judging, is it really likely to work? Mr. MacArthur.
Well, I think I'll defer to my Chinese colleagues on the specifics of the proposed reforms, but I would say that I think there are a couple of big picture points to just stress here. And one is that China is a very unique situation. Given the level of development of the country overall, it actually still has a pretty significant and large share of its population in the rural areas, and that's due to the history of the government's policies around migration and the hukou system from rural to urban areas. And so the labor markets are actually a huge piece of this. Roughly 50%, or actually I think the latest statistic is about 54% of China's population still lives in the rural areas. That's about the same, roughly 50% as, say, a country like Ghana, which has a much lower GDP per capita. And so one of the big questions is how the markets work for people to move to equilibrate a little more the incomes. There's a second piece, which is about the productivity of the farms.
Right.
And there's a big debate in many countries about how to make sure it's not just the big farms, but also the small farms. This is where we see countries like Brazil. President Lula actually created a whole ministry to support small farmers along the big farmers. But then there's a third piece, which is what I would call the social services and the income services that are everything from the health and education services for the rural areas to also the credit, financing, and this area of the public investment matching with the private investment to boost the income support and increase risk-taking among farmers in a way that they don't have to carry too much risk, that there's insurance. All three of these need to be taken on at once.
It seems that many of the points you mentioned, Mr. MacArthur, have been really at the center of debate here in China as well. Not just right now, but really for some years.
Exactly.
So that's why I want to come back to you, Yan, about exactly what is the role of the market. Because when we talk of the role of the market, let the market decide all the allocating of resources, let the market decide where the product would go, let the market decide what kind of crops the farmers would like to produce. But agriculture in countries do not work like that, just as Mr. MacArthur mentioned. A lot of times, the government provides support and subsidies to agriculture as long as it's not for exports, not create unfair trade. And also a lot of times it has to look at the food security. And in China's case, it's probably even more because farmers occupy such a huge percentage of the overall population. So Yan, what exactly is the situation?
Because agriculture is not only an industry, it's providing public goods. So for agriculture, we usually we always talking about three-dimensional agriculture issues in China, and we always put farmers in the first.
What are the two other dimensions?
Farmers, village, and also rural agriculture. So three-dimensional agriculture issues, we always talking that in China. And when we're talking about market, you must have noticed that in recent years, every year we have some farmers, they overproduction and they can't sell their goods because they only know this year the market is good, so all the farmers grow the same varieties, and next year they will lose all the money. So if we only let the market decide, that's the reason why we saw lots of market failures, that farmers will not benefit from the market.
So what is the way out if that is the case?
Let the farmers organized. So the farmers knows what the market will be better to grow next year. So they and also it should be decided by the demands. So the consumers, what the consumers needs, then the market, then the farmers grow.
But will the farmers, as Yan mentioned, Holly, once organized, be able to achieve the goals that she aspired them to do it?
There's a long way to go. Definitely education and improving the human resource quality of farmers. But I think for Chinese agriculture, there are two main conflicts here. One is the food security you mentioned. That is the overall supply and productivity. And another thing is increasing farmers' income. So unlike Ghana, that as Mr. MacArthur just mentioned, China is already developing this situation that we have non-farm sector urbanization that attract a lot of rural laborers. And actually, Chinese farmers already migrant to workers are working on non-farm sectors. So for the farm, they demand a particular return to labor. So labor cost is already at that level.
That's right.
So this is connected to the supply side. We got to increase the productivity. So now, actually, there are several things the Chinese government already recognized they can go. One is relax the constraints on resource. Land is one thing, like allowing farmers to grow larger scale and allow the land rights.
Land is one thing. What are the others?
Others, finance.
Okay.
Rural finance, loan, and all of those are constrained. And other things, labor as well. So China, labor are free to move to cities to
yes,
work.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. The laborers are free to move, and we see its effect so far. In fact, China is a nation with rapid urbanization.
Yep.
More Chinese farmers get their income elsewhere from their land. Take a look at some of the statistics we have for you. Only 20 out of 100 yuan made by Chinese farmers these days is from agriculture. The average land managed by each farmer has decreased from 10 mu, which is a Chinese way of calculating it, over 6,000 square meters, to 5 mu in 2016. Agricultural population makes up to 28% of the nation's whole, contributing only, though, 9% of the GDP. I think there's one thing we should talk about, which is the plus side. That is, farmers has more ways to make a living. But on the other hand, who is going to be responsible for the farming itself? And can farmers come back, still have their land? That is the key issue here. So, Yan, I know you've been doing a lot of research about that. You are now living China's rural area, despite the fact that you're a doctor degree intellectual. So help us to understand what exactly is the situation. Is this land reform now we're talking about out of this conference likely to change the overall picture?
Just like what we have seen in last 10 years, a lot of people, they come, especially some people with capital, they come to the rural, to the village, they rent a lot of land. But what I have seen, people who have succeeded in managing agriculture or managing their farm are very few people. So a lot of land, actually, people, some companies, they rent the land, but they don't know how to manage, how to sell the products. So that's the problem.
The question, I think, it seems, is when the land has more freedom to move around, will farmers really benefit from it? Because after all, that's what we're talking about here. It's not supposed to benefit the real estate economy, but rather the farmers themselves. What do you say, Holly?
China's agricultural reform started when the land ownership and land contracting rights separated. Now it's the new wave of land reform, separation of land contracting right and operating right. So farmers can still own the land, well, in the sense, can still have the contracting right, but they are not necessarily the operator of the manager of the land. So we're looking for some professionals like Dr. Tian and Dr. Shi, that to be the professional farm managers. So farmer can have different ways of still owning the land while hiring professionals. Farmers co-op is one thing. They can form a cooperation.
And there are other options for them?
Some of them will grow, become very capable managers themselves.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. MacArthur, I'm sure the debates you have just heard also typical in some other economies, but China's scale we are talking about is very different. Therefore, how to make sure central plan economy now to a more market-oriented. But at the same time, farmers' rights has to be guaranteed. At the same time, food security has to be guaranteed. All of these tasks juggling. Mr. MacArthur.
You're exactly right. And I think, again, big picture, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that over time, most societies see people move from rural farm areas to cities. So in the most advanced economies in the world, maybe only 10% of the people still live on farms. And that's because over the generations, they sell their land, someone else comes in and invests in that land, they make more money in the city, they buy the food from the farmers in the rural area, and over time, those markets help to balance things out. So what we're talking about isn't a farmer at one point in time. We're talking about societies moving from farming to more urban-based economies and building the productivity at the farms to feed the people in the cities. Now, the big piece of this that's sensitive, of course, in every country, and every country has its own approach to it, is land and food. These are very emotional topics. They're very politically sensitive topics. Who owns the land? How do we manage land? How do we ensure food safety? Many countries actually like to export food to get income so that they can, make the most of what they're really good at, but then spend it on other things.
So those are
other countries want to make sure that they have domestic food.
Those are certainly some of the solutions, but eventually what we are still talking about, like Mr. MacArthur mentioned, two very key issues: land, which is the real resources, and the people, the farmers themselves. Final words from both of you. Where are we going? Yan.
I think because in China we are resource constrained and also so many populations, none of the country compare with China. So we really should be careful about the land reform and also farmers' rights.
Okay, Holly.
Legalize the separation between farm contracting right and farm operating right, and giving farmers who choose to live and work in cities equal rights as city urban citizens.
Easier said than done, as we all know that, but it's very important that we have the right direction. Thank you so much for the three of you, Shi Yan, Holly Wang, and John MacArthur. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. We have a very full discussion for you. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.